Liberal Party, John Perkis, and he was an early parliamentarian in the Progressive Liberal Party. Next to her is June Stevenson, Cyril Stevenson's wife, and an amazing woman who came from England and later married Cyril Stevenson, worked with his Nassau Herald, which was the voice of the Progressive Liberal Party, and also the women's suffrage movement used that as their organ of getting their work across. And you can see them in these wonderful sashes across their chests. And so when I met with June Stevenson, she showed me this, and I thought I'd bring it for you, because it really just, when I saw this, it really grounded for me the women's suffrage movement. It was like, it is real. And it's the same sashes that they're wearing in that picture there. And as you can see, it's old, but as you can see from this, it's also showing you that these women use the same kinds of representation as other women's suffrage movements did. I mean, the British suffrage movement's women also had these kinds of sashes. So did the American suffrage movement. They wore these sashes and did their demonstrations. So the Bahamians did the same thing. A lot of creative imitation, which was, and it's also a part of unity and solidarity too. So women's suffrage movement, I think this is, I've seen this before. Dame Marguerite Pindling, I think, has one, and she showed it to me later. But I think it's the only two still here. All right. So they call on the governor in September 1960 again about the right to vote for women. In November of 1960, the Progressive Liberal Party is now fully on board with trying to get the right to vote for women for its own reasons. Doris Johnson is a member of the Progressive Liberal Party, a very staunch member. And they decide in November of 1962 to go to the House of Commons, to go to England, to make representation there, because what's happening locally is basically nothing. There's stalling tactics on the part of the United Bahamian Party, and in terms of the enfranchisement of women. So the Progressive Liberal Party elects H.M. Taylor, he's chairman of the party still, and Doris Johnson and Eugenia Lockhart to go to England and make representation on behalf of the women's suffrage movement. And this particular trip was funded by women doing fundraising on a day called Vote Flag Day, where they sold little pins, etc., to raise funds. Charles Rodriguez was also a funder. Eugenia Lockhart, according to her children, actually funded her own way and also helped Doris Johnson to go. So there are lots of stories around how the three of them got to England and met with the colonial secretary there, another colonial, Ian MacLeod by this time, and also met with two women parliamentarians who were strong suffragists from the early days of the British suffrage movement and were strong supporters of the local Bahamian women's movement, and ushered them through the process of seeing the officials there to make representation. And basically what they're asking is for the House of Commons to enact an imperial act of parliament if the local United Bahamian Party won't do it. And so it's really the turning point. That's November of 1960. In December of 1960, the United Bahamian Party meets as a party. This is a month later, and they decide under Jeffrey Johnstone, who is the person who advances the resolution, that women ought to be given the right to vote. And it was passed 63-2 within the United Bahamian Party conclave. And by February 23rd, 1961, the act was passed. February 23rd, 1961, the act was passed to enfranchise women to vote in the next general election, which would have been November of 1962. So on elections, in between the enactment of the legislation and the actual voting day, November 1962, about 18 months or so, the women's suffrage movement was at its peak. It really got women out to register. They were still doing their political work, to education classes frequently about citizenship and what the right to vote meant. And it was during these periods that they talked about the Magna Carta, the Atlantic Charter, the Iron Curtain speech, the UN conventions, in the same way that women today talked about CEDAW the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination, of all forms of discrimination against women. So these women also did the same thing, which I really find amazing. And this is in their documents. I'm not making this up. All right. So they do some intense public education and get women to go out in droves to register for the election. Doris Johnson herself decides to run as a member of the Progressive Liberal Party. She ran again in Eleuthera, along with Cecil Wallace Whitfield and also Preston Albury. Eleuthera was on United Bahamian Party lockdown. They did not win in Eleuthera. All three of them lost. However, Doris Johnson is an amazing feat on her part, just to be the first woman to actually contest an election and fearlessly. And
sorry.
Yes.
Did she actually run?
Yes.
And where she withdrew, she did register to run.
No. Colin Hughes. She ran. Yes, definitely. And it's in the documents. It's in the historical documents that she ran with Cecil Wallace Whitfield and Preston Albury. Later on, there were some political issues. Because I think she left Nassau after that and finished up her dissertation and then came back and worked more with the PLP. So at this time, in 1962, the United Bahamian Party won that election. All right, they had 23 seats. The PLP got, I think, 8 seats. Alvin Brennan and Sir Randall Fox got their independent seats. The historical documents show that the Progressive Liberal Party actually got the popular vote. And so the issue really was around how the boundaries were constructed. And in any case, the United Bahamian Party was absolutely victorious. By this time, the tourist economy had been restored. There was tremendous stability. And one of the things that I found interesting too was that the Cuban Missile Crisis actually took place around October of 1962. And Michael Creighton, in his book, points to that as a possibility of people feeling a little uneasy about changing the status quo, for one. And the results were that the United Bahamian Party won the election. So in 1962, Mary Ingram was 61 when she voted for the first time. Mabel Walker, whom I didn't talk much about because I'm kind of going through this very quickly, I understand from her family that she did not vote because she was not a British subject. She was a woman from South Carolina in the United States, and you wouldn't have known it. I mean, she just passed as a Bahamian and thought of herself as a Bahamian, and anyway, she would have been 60 at the time. And Georgiana Simonette was 60 when she voted for the first time. Eugenia Lockhart was 54, and Doris Johnson basically thought that would have inured to the benefit of the Progressive Liberal Party. I mean, that would have been sort of the thing. Because of the racial divide, that was obvious. That's one reason, you know.
No, I just
because
right.
I guess a part of it we need to really hold is that enfranchisement around the suffrage in the Bahamas also dovetailed with a larger enfranchisement post, during slavery. I mean, there was agitation during slavery for enfranchisement. So enfranchisement isn't something that just began with the suffrage movement or universal suffrage for even men in the 1940s and 50s. The process of enfranchisement would have begun during slavery, way back when. So enfranchisement, had several layers of meaning enfranchisement of black people who would have been enslaved during the 19th century and 18th century. So these things were all part of the larger tapestry.
I just want to say I enjoyed it very much, and I just wanted to express a hope that clearly you didn't have much time to give an exposition of all this. But there is a dimension that I hope you will include,
yes,
which is the general Bahamian public and their reactions to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what does the Guardian say? What does the Herald say?
Exactly.
What does the Tribune say?
Exactly.
In other words, we all know the famous editor of the Tribune who proposed unilaterally to have destroyed racial discrimination.
Right.
Okay, where was the support coming? Were the Bahamian people buying your flies? Were you being booed in places,
Yes, certainly Sadie and DePuch formed the in 1955 formed the Bahamas Democratic League, which was a political party that ran in the 1956 election. That party, along with the Progressive Liberal Party, were the two parties that supported the suffrage for women. And so, yeah, I mean, what I've done really is really very selective and anecdotal, and there is a much larger picture which I want to continue to talk about. And thank you for bringing that up. And yes, I mean, through the BDL, there was the whole anti-racial discrimination resolution that was put forward in Parliament by Serti and Depute, which is a part of the background of the women's suffrage movement too. Yes.
Just to give some context, I think I'll double check the dates, but women weren't given the right to vote in Switzerland until 1962.
Right.
Women were not given the right to vote in Liechtenstein until 1972.
Right, and then Saudi Arabia, even now, exactly. But we're talking about the British Empire right now, so which did have it before Liechtenstein and Switzerland. Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, this says 1951. Way before the Indian Duke, maybe it was like 1996.
Bert Cambridge. Bert Cambridge also. You know, this has been a very, you know, lasered view of the women's suffrage movement. It has a huge context, which I tried to talk about. And yes, I've
big difference between Indian Duke and
Bert Cambridge.
And Bert Cambridge was that there was an act where in the Indian Duke's case there was a resolution.
Yes. There was a resolution. Right. All right, well, like, if I could just speak to this, the research that I've done and the actual documents and the way I am framing this, I have not done tonight for obvious reasons, time, etc. But we have there will be a website on all of this.